Good evening, everyone, and thank you once again for joining us here at Capstone Educational Consultants College Journey Conversations. This summer, we're so excited to have our special guest with us, Maria Furtado, the Executive Director of Colleges That Change Lives, CTCL. We're so excited to have you, Maria. Thank you for joining us all the way from the Bay Area of California tonight. So we're so excited to have you.
Thank you, Mark. I always appreciate being asked, so thank you.
Yeah, share with us a little bit. We're going to get into a lot of detail with Colleges That Change Lives. We want to know all we can about that particular topic. We're going to dive right into it. But before we do, we'd love to hear a little bit about your involvement in CTCL and how you came about getting involved in it.
So I have been doing college admission work for about 25 and a half years, be 26 years in January. And about 23 years ago, roughly, the first book came out, Colleges That Change Lives, written by Lauren Pope. And Clark University, which is where I was working at the time, was one of the schools profiled. And we decided to go to the meeting that was called to kind of talk about should we, could we, might we, maybe work together as a group to share information about the college search, to hopefully get people to think about the search differently, as well as, of course, to recruit for the individual institutions. And so I went to that meeting, and then I was lucky. And my college Clark sent me on one of the very, very, very first tours that we did. So we have been touring together since 1998. They sent me on one of the very first tours. And I really loved it because the questions were different than at a traditional college fair. The people were already somewhat predisposed to a liberal arts college, which was kind of nice. You didn't have to spend as much time selling that. You could talk about the value, but you didn't have to convince people quite as much. And so, like often happens with a group of institutions or people that start to work together, a handful of people decide, well, we can help. We can do some of this leadership stuff. So a few of us started kind of being the unofficial leaders, and then we eventually evolved or morphed into this advisory board for an unofficial group of people that were working together. Lauren published a second book. He published a third book. And at that point, when he published the third book, he was in his mid-90s at that time. So we were relatively confident he would not write another book, not to be cynical, but he was already in his mid-90s. And so we wanted to continue working together. So we asked his blessing to start a nonprofit. And so about 15 years ago, we received his blessing. We started a nonprofit organization with the 40 schools that were in that book in 2006. Those are our founding charter schools. Okay. And then in 2012, after Lauren had passed, his family commissioned an author to do a revision of the book. And when she did that, she took 4 schools out and put 4 schools in, which makes perfect sense when you're publishing the 4th version of the same book. Yeah. And so she took 4 schools out, put 4 schools in. They chose to join our nonprofit, which then brought us to 44 schools. And then in October of 2018, Bard College in upstate New York was interested in being part of the organization. We believe that their admission work is very representative of what we try to do as an organization. We were interested in potentially expanding a little, so they joined us in October of 2018. So then we were 45 schools. And then just the very end of June of this year, Marlborough College merged with Emerson College. And so Marlborough is no longer part of Colleges That Change Lives. So we're back to 44 members. And then as we became a nonprofit, we had to have leadership. So I was the first chair of the board of the nonprofit. I was the first past chair. And then the executive director position became available as I was looking for a position. So the board was kind enough to approve me to be the executive director, and it will be 7 months in August of this year. So it's been a long and interesting journey to see how all of this has evolved, basically from a lunch at a conference and someone saying, wouldn't this be interesting to work together? And it's been fascinating.
Now, you mentioned here in your introduction a little bit about the fact that they're liberal arts colleges. Correct. So all of the colleges in the CTL group are liberal arts colleges. Is that correct?
That's correct. So there are 44 liberal arts colleges and universities in 25 states.
In fact, we're going to actually scroll them behind me, so you'll be able to. Our viewers will have a great look at the 44 that we're talking about. But when we're talking about liberal arts colleges, Maria, what exactly would our viewers need to know about what that means?
Well, there's a couple of things they need to know are not true.
Oh,
Well, first, liberal arts colleges are not just for liberals.
very good.
Pretty
Okay.
common misperception. There are a lot of folks out there say, oh, liberal arts colleges, just liberals, all liberal. It's not. And within our 44, I can absolutely send students and families to look at a few schools that are definitely more conservative socially and politically. The second misperception is often that liberal arts colleges don't do science, that there's only humanities and social science and art. But these colleges and colleges like them, because these are clearly not the only 44 schools that change lives, they're not the only 44 liberal arts colleges.
Right.
But these schools came together because of Lauren Pope's work and experience in understanding how well these students are transformed through the education at these colleges. But there are sciences. There are hard sciences: biology, chemistry, physics, biochem, math, environmental science, computer science, and often there's engineering at these schools. Not just 3-2 engineering, where they have to partner with another school, but we now have 4 schools that offer engineering in 4 years on campus. So the misperceptions typically are that, again, they're all liberal, that there's no science. And then often the misperception is that they are too small and that there's not opportunity that you would have at a big school. And I think the answer to that is twofold. One, on the academic side, there are still probably anywhere between 30 and 50 majors on these campuses. Now, for those who offer specific majors, the most I have ever known a person to do is 3 majors. And she was pretty stellar. She still is pretty stellar, really.
Yeah.
But most people often people will do 2 and maybe a minor.
Right.
They sometimes get ambitious. They do 2 majors, 2 minors, and that's great. But you don't need 100. And so sometimes the idea is, well, I need all of these to choose from. You still have between 30 and 50 to choose from. And that's typically very sufficient for a student. I think the other thing on the social side is people say, well, these schools are relatively small. So our schools average about 1,550 students. And so the perception is for a lot of kids, especially from big public high schools like the one I went to, oh, well, there's only 1,500 people. I'll know everybody by the 3rd day.
Right.
And the reality is you don't. We are human creatures who tend to find a group of people with whom we connect. And we tend to socialize with that group of people. My high school had close to 4,000 people. I knew a lot of people by sight, but I hung out with the same 10 to 15 people most of the time. Right. And when I got to college, there were about 1,100 students, and I wondered if it was going to be too small. I hung out with the same 10 to 15 people most of the time. So I think that's who we are as humans, is we tend to create a small world around us. And right now, while everyone's sheltering in place and trying to be as careful as we can about how we interact with people, our world feels smaller in a weird way, even though it's still a large world, a big world. But I think that that idea that they're too small is really a fallacy for the student who wants to be known.
Right.
These are not great schools for a kid that wants to be anonymous. No question. You want to be anonymous? These are not the place to go. You need to pick a very big school for that. These are schools where people will know your name. And by people, I mean faculty, administration, people who work in offices, coaches that don't coach your team will know your name. And it's that kind of community. And I think that serves so many students really well, that 18 to 22-year-old that really needs those connections. But it doesn't serve everybody. And that's a fair thing to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, these are campuses that, as you said, are small, they're intimate, and the professors and student, they know each other fairly well. There's typically, if I recall correctly, there's a small faculty student ratio, and they're getting that time, that one-on-one exposure with their professor, that those smaller environments really are great and conducive to good learning. Now let's talk a little bit about why. Like, why is there a need for us to have a list of colleges that are distinctively like this list and says they change lives?
Well, there probably isn't.
Say that again.
There probably isn't a need, technically, officially. But what happened was Lauren Pope, who wrote the books, the original books, he worked in higher ed for years and years he worked in higher ed. But most of his career he spent at the New York Times as the education editor. And he wrote about higher education in the US. And he wrote about what he learned about different institutions. He went to a small liberal arts college. He went to DePauw with a W in Indiana. And he loved what he heard and read and understood about small liberal arts colleges. Eventually, people started coming to him for advice. So he started counseling families, and he sent thousands of kids off to these small liberal arts colleges to visit. Some enrolled. And when they did, they came back and they said, Lauren, this place changed my life. It changed my life. I became a better thinker, a better writer, able to be who I am. And so that transformational experience was what he learned about. And what happens, because Americans love lists, is eventually people said, Lauren, can't you make us a list of good schools? And he said, no, but I'll write a book. And he wrote his first book, which was called Looking Beyond the Ivy League. He touched on about 200 schools in that book in narrative form, and families loved it. They found it incredibly helpful. And they came back and said, Lauren, this is great. It's a wonderful book. Could you make us a list of good schools? And he said, no, I'm not making a list, but I'll write another book. And so he wrote Colleges That Changed Lives. He was in his mid 80s when he did. And he profiled schools in more depth. And what has been super important about the work that we do together and the work that these schools do individually is the focus is truly on the student from the beginning to the end. So what I mean by that is the admission process is not focused on how do we get so many applications that we become selective. It's really focused on how do we get the right applications so we can admit students that would thrive here. How do we find that group of kids? And once they're in the admission process, it's very personal. This is not, column A, 3 things, column B, 4 things, plus 2 activities is an admit, and another formula is a deny. This is a human being sitting and reading the folder, looking at all of the pieces, and sometimes reaching out by phone, by email, in person, and saying, hey, Mark, I noticed this really cool thing on your application, but I don't quite understand. Can you help me understand? Or there's a note that you would drop in the mail that says, congratulations, Mark, on your admission. I loved that cool thing you did with that club when you're in high school. It's very personal. And one of the things I loved, I worked at 2 of these schools. I worked at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts. I worked at Eckerd College in St. Petersburg, Florida. One of my favorite things was admitted student time, because kids would come to campus and we'd walk up. It's like, hey, how are you? It's so good to see you. I loved your essay. Oh my goodness. I so want to hang out with your grandmother, just that personal feeling is very indicative of what these kids will get during their experience on campus. That's why it's important. It's not so much that we're good admission people, although they're good admission people. It's really more about this is indicative of how your experience will unfold over 4 years. People will care. They will ask. They will watch for you. They will guide. They will mentor. And they will not, if at all possible, let a kid fall through the cracks.
Right.
And it's not so much that they're going to drag them around to make them succeed. I mean, these have to be motivated kids. But what they will do is give everybody the tools they need to be successful. And so I think that where we don't technically need a list, Lauren wrote the books really because of family interest in this topic. And what he asked people to do was not so much get caught up in rank and rating, but to get caught up in what actually happens on campus. What's the experience? Because the research shows it's not about the rank of the school that the student goes to that helps them be successful. It's what the kid does with their time on campus.
Yeah.
That's what makes them successful.
Exactly. Well, I want to take just a second and say hello to all those that are watching with us today. And on our Facebook page, we're so excited to have you. If you have any questions, feel free to write them out in the chat on Facebook, and we'll get to those and see if we can get those answered. If you don't have any questions, that's great. You just sit back and enjoy the ride, right? So Maria, we're so excited to have you all the way from the Bay Area of California. In case our viewers missed that at the very beginning, we've got a scrolling number of colleges in the background. These are all members right now of the Colleges That Change Lives group, right now at a number of 44 colleges. And so we're pretty excited to have all of those listed here in the background. You know, on the front cover of the book that you keep referring to, and this is I think one of the older versions.
Actually, that's the most recent version, Mark.
This is the most recent. Okay, so it does say 40 on the front. So I know there's 44 now, so that's changed just a little bit. But I want to make reference to a slogan that's on the front of it, and it says, "These are 40 schools that will change the way you think about colleges." And I was struck by the comment of how it was stated here, change the way you think about college. How so? How will this book or the list per se change that way we think about colleges? What is it referring to when you say that?
It's really referring to what Lauren found as he worked with students over the years, and as what we have found as administrators and admission reps over the years. These schools do something special. It's, again, these are not the only 44 that do something special, but these were the ones Lauren chose to write about. And he would very happily tell you, were he here, you don't like my 40 or 44, write your own book. He had no issue telling people that. If you don't like mine, write your own. Right. But really what he found was that the way that students talked about their experience was very different. And what I have seen is really interesting. So parents and students will come to our program. And at the end of the program, they'll come up and they say, you know, we had such a great night. And often one of the parents, we'll just go with dad and mom at this point. Dad will say, oh my gosh, what you talked about in the opening, what these schools talked about was my experience at such and such little school. I had such great relationships with my faculty. I got to do so much more because the school was a little bit smaller, because there were not graduate students doing all the research. I could do the research, and my experience was so amazing. And then the mom will say, yeah, not at all what I got. And I'm so glad my child is looking at something different. Actually, true story. One of my best friends since 7th grade went to Earlham College. Now, we grew up in Massachusetts, and she went to a school in Indiana, which when I was 17, I thought was the most amazingly crazy thing you could possibly do. I now have many, many great friends who went to Earlham College, but at that point, I thought it was the most amazing thing.
Right.
Her husband went to the University of Michigan, and they have had this conversation. I have heard them have this conversation. She talks about, oh, you know, when I went on this research project with so-and-so, and we really got invested in it, and we worked on it for the whole semester. And Ben's kind of like, no. When I did my PhD, yeah, but no, not when I did an undergrad. Right. And so the experience is just different. The quality of connection is different. And the interesting part is a lot of these schools are a little bit less traditional in the way that they do their education, especially right now. So, for example, Cornell College in Iowa for years has done one class at a time. So a student does 18 days, that's a semester. It's jam-packed in there, and they are very intense 18 days, and then they have 3-4 days off, and they do their next semester. St. John's College in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and Annapolis, Maryland. They do what they call the Great Books Program. And everybody is doing the same thing at the same time if they're first-year students. You start with Aristotle and Plato and Socrates. That's the one I was looking for, Socrates. And they do math by reading Euclid. And they work their way through what's considered the Great Canon. And they've done a very good job expanding that to make sure that it's more representative of women and people of color and not just old dead white guys. They've really done a great job working on that. But I think that their program, again, is very differently structured than so many other institutions. A lot of these schools do a 4-1-4 calendar. So 4 classes in the fall, 1 intensive 3-week class in January, 4 classes in the spring. And that, again, gives the students an opportunity usually to work those 3 weeks with a really intensive relationship with faculty, whether traveling abroad, doing some research locally. So the way that these schools are structured, I think, really does change the way that people think about college. Because we, especially Americans, let me put it this way. I think Americans have one kind of picture of what higher ed is. And some of it is kind of the big typical big campus, big football game, frat sororities, kind of the biggest experience. And then I think that often abroad, students abroad have very similar expectation, and they expect that big experience. But when you talk with people about what the important factors about their experiences, it's typically the relationship building and the relationships that make a huge difference. And if you are an assertive, confident 18-year-old and they're out there, I think big schools do well for those kids because they're willing to go up after class every day and say, "Hi, Professor Cruver, I really liked your class today. Nice to, I sit in the 4th row, 15 seats back, that one." And then when they have a question, then they feel confident enough to go up and ask. At this kind of school, the biggest classes on some of these campuses, probably 40, 50 people at the most. The hardest thing about doing a big program for admitted students on this kind of campus is there's nowhere for a lot of people to sit, which right now is okay.
Right.
On a traditional time, not having a place for 200 people to sit is hard, but they don't have big class space. Right. So I think that the way that the schools talk about education, the way that the schools talk about the relationship building, the way that the alumni talk about their experiences is really what helps families and students and counselors too start to think about it differently. I don't want you to think I forgot the point of your question, but really that think about it differently piece comes from the way that these schools talk about it and the way that the kids talk about their experience. And even the faculty will say, I went to a big school, or I went to a small school and wanted to replicate that experience from the other side of the desk, or I went to a big school and felt I missed something and I love being at this smaller school. So the book that you raised is from 2012. So no question that some of the academic pieces have changed in those 8 years. Yeah. The opening chapters are still incredibly valuable for people. And that's, I think, where it probably has still its most value. We hope you'll come to our website, use our search engine, use the kind of the quick profile information on our website, and then go to the school's websites. And when we can all visit freely again, very much want you to go and visit the campuses and talk to people about their experience.
Can you tell us, Maria, which 4 colleges in the CTCL group have engineering on their campus?
Sure. So it's Hope College in Michigan, okay. Cornell College in Iowa, and then McDaniel College is just bringing it up at this point in time. And there's a 4th one. I'm going to have to let that sit in my head for a minute. Okay. Because their program is a little bit newer and it's not in my head right this minute. But those 3 I know for sure.
So you've talked a little bit about colleges that have were the founding 40, mm-hmm. if you will. And some of them have been removed or they've left the list, and others have come back into the list. And some have grown the list. So what actually causes a college to get on the list, or how do they get on the list? What prescribes them to be able to get on it, or why do they leave the list? Why?
Well, really, the only one school that has left the organization is Marlboro College. Okay. And that's because they merged with Emerson College, and therefore we're no longer really a small liberal arts college. They're now a different type of institution. They are the Marlboro Institute of Liberal Arts within Emerson College. And it will still have great value and really will add something to the Emerson experience for kids, and also expand the experience for the Marlboro students that chose to transfer to Emerson. The other schools, everybody has remained within the group. The 4 schools that were profiled in the 2012 book, so that was Hillsdale College in Michigan, Willamette University, in Oregon, University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington, and St. Mary's College of California in the Bay Area, California. So those 4 schools were newly profiled when Hillary Maisel Oswald updated the book. And so we invited them to join our nonprofit, and they chose to do so. We have had more conversations than I even care to admit about how or when, how, if we should grow as an organization. And we have a couple of challenges about that. Number one is we would have to sit down, by we, I mean the board. The board would really have to sit down and establish a criteria set that is probably based on Lauren's criteria and then grows from Lauren's criteria to be a 2020, 2021 version of what makes sense. And we have not done that. And we don't know who would do the vetting, for example. So would you send board members? Would you send your executive director? Who would pay for all of that? Which is a very practical question. Who would pay for it? And then what would be the purpose is really the bigger question. We could grow, no problem.
No doubt.
Because there are many schools that are very similar to us that are inclusive in their admission. And that was one of Lauren's real loves, was the idea of getting the word out about schools that still admitted a good number of students. The average admit rate for our schools is about 65%, which is the national average for admission. We don't talk about that average. We talk about the 17 schools, roughly, that admit less than 10%, and the 35 schools or 45 schools that admit less than 20%.
Right.
So we tend to talk about this teeny tiny subset of all of the 2,700 colleges. We talk about this teeny tiny subset.
Right.
Whereas the average admit rate is 65%, which is right where we are as a group. And so Lauren really loved the idea of highlighting schools that were lesser known. So families and counselors and students will ask me lots of times, well, what schools do you think? And it's kind of like a secret. What schools do you think would be a really good addition? And I think there are a lot of schools that would be a great addition. Places like Warren Wilson in North Carolina, Prescott College in Arizona, Lewis and Clark up in Oregon, Northland in Wisconsin. There's a lot of schools that would be a super addition. It's just that we don't want to grow just because we can.
Right.
Because that's not how we want to be. We don't want to be sort of the nonprofit equivalent of the school that grows its applications so it can deny more kids to become more selective. We don't want to be them. We want to, if we're going to grow, we want to grow in a very thoughtful, very organic way. And that's why we've really kind of held where we are now for a while.
Right. You indicated earlier that many, or if not most of the colleges in the CTCL list are small by nature. Unfortunately,
and by design.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, absolutely,
yeah.
By design. But we've unfortunately heard the rumblings over the years, and even more so in recent news, that some smaller schools are financially struggling, and they're doing that due to a declining in enrollment or their demographics. And unfortunately, recently, because of COVID, we've heard some come about, even that are in this list of CTL schools that are of concern. But more importantly, can you give families who are listening, oh, we love the pup. That's awesome. We have
This is Ernie.
Hey, Ernie. It's so awesome. We didn't have you on the lineup, but we're so glad to have you.
He doesn't have much to say most of the time, fortunately.
Oh, that's all good. We love to have him. He's a great magnet for us. That's awesome. But can you give families an idea on how to evaluate a campus's financial viability?
Absolutely. I think it is absolutely the right thing to ask about financial viability. Sometimes people are worried, well, should we, could we? Absolutely. Right. You should ask. Ask, have they been getting their class recently? Have you made your class? Have you filled your class? Have you found that your endowment is holding steady? So for example, I worked at Clark during the 2008 recession, and our endowment held beautifully because the person that was really leading the investment of the endowment was he was really good at what he did. And so he held the money, and the money held really strongly. So I think that's a very important question to ask. Are they making their class? How's their endowment? Is it staying strong? Do they feel like it's invested well? And sometimes the younger reps are a little bit less comfortable asking that question but you can always ask them to find out and get back to you, and then see if they do, because I think that's important as well. I think it's good to ask, how has been your most recent year, and then recognize that this recent year was pretty challenging. And a lot of families and students are looking at this in a very different way as they go through the search to make sure that they understand about distance from home and how is the academic program changing this year. Are they going to be online? Are they be partially online? Are they going to be mostly in person? A lot of schools, what I have noticed, I've noticed two things. One is the announcements that we all feel we have to make, which are basically, we'll open on campus unless we can't. Now, they're being good academicians and good people from higher ed. They use a lot more words than that.
Right.
But basically what they're saying is, we'll be on campus unless we can.
Right.
And then the second thing I've noticed is a lot of schools are starting early. They're starting earlier than they typically do by 2 to 3 weeks. They're dropping their semester break in October, and then they'll be done right before Thanksgiving. They'll either be done with finals, or some are be done with the academic experience on campus, and they will then move to 1 or 2 weeks of online and then finals online. So the schools, I think it's important to ask about how they worked with kids this year. How did they work with students who didn't have a place to go, didn't have a safe place to be? Were they allowed to stay on campus? Were they able to help them? And even if they weren't truly financially able to help them, were they willing?
Right.
For example, you can read some really interesting stories. Wheaton College had some faculty and staff who took in some international kids because to fly home was either way too expensive or you couldn't fly there at that point in time. So how did they take care of their community? I think talks a lot about what will continue to happen within that community.
I think that's huge too, Maria. Like that's a huge indication of the college's character, right? And one of those kind of remarkable attributes of the CTCL schools is how they take care of their community.
I think so too. I really do. Now, none of these schools is perfect.
No.
I don't want to make it seem that way. None of these schools is perfect. No school is perfect.
Right.
But I do feel like this is a community of people who truly care and
Yes.
are trying to make sure that their students are safe, their faculty are safe, their staff is safe, that everyone is still learning and progressing. And also remembering that, the faculty that we expect to turn around and teach in a completely different way also might be homeschooling their own kids or taking care of an elderly parent, that they are actually people too who are trying to get through an incredibly difficult situation.
Yeah, I myself am a product of a small private Christian liberal arts college. And, it was really, really important to us to know that we weren't a number. We were first and last name, sometimes just on a first name basis. And that's really a great place to be, to feel like you're home every time you step into a classroom.
Absolutely.
Good stuff. So when you think of a student going to a CTL school, what kind of student comes to mind?
That's a great question. I think you have to be an engaged student. You don't have to be a stellar student, but you have to be an engaged student. You have to be the one that loves to learn, I think, to do well on this kind of campus. A lot of these schools are actually really intellectual. Sometimes people think, oh, it's a small liberal arts school, it'll be a sweet experience. Yeah, you got to go to class. These are intellectual institutions, and they have expectations of these kids. I know a woman who went to Eckerd College, and Eckerd sometimes, so to give you a context, I worked at Clark in Worcester, kind of a very New England working class town. I went to work at Eckerd College, which is in St. Petersburg, Florida, and has 1.25 miles of waterfront property. And so in my interview, after taking the campus tour and thinking, wow, this is beautiful, I said to my potential colleagues, I said, so what's hard about recruiting for Eckerd? And they said, location. And I thought, really? How can that possibly be? But there's an idea. I think Americans, especially New Englanders, have this idea that if it's not dark and cold, it's not the academic year. And so that idea that you can write a good paper at the beach, just like you can write a good paper in a snow, inside watching snowfall, is hard for some folks to get through their minds. But I think you have to be an engaged person. At Eckerd, my thing was always, I felt that kids worked hard and played hard. They were people who understood how to have a balanced life. They were not going to allow the work piece to rob them of the opportunity to have a good life outside the classroom. And I always respect that a lot about those kids, a lot. I think you find that the students who are here tend to be socially conscious, however they define that. So this kind of goes back way at the beginning where we're talking about liberal versus conservative, socially, politically. However they define that social conscience is important to them, no matter what end of the spectrum it is. Right. I think you find a lot of these students who fit well at these schools are very environmentally aware and internationally aware. So they care about the bigger issues. They're not just saying, how can I get through this college and get out and get myself a job and I make money? A lot of it is about how do I get through college and understand how to do good while doing well. And so you'll see a lot of these schools produce teachers, they produce entrepreneurs, but a lot of those entrepreneurs have a socially conscious spin to the work that they do. You see a lot of people going out into healthcare. You see a lot of people going out into the caring professions, if you want to look at it that way. You don't see as much of the it's all about me perspective. And that's why I think that people who want that small community and want to be invested in a community do really well on these campuses.
Right. Can you think of a population of people, either in a group, a working class, a working group, or otherwise, a population of people that you wish knew about the colleges that change lives, that maybe don't know about it?
That's a really interesting question, because in some ways, it's the two ends of the socioeconomic spectrum. So in some ways, it's the financially successful, brand conscious,
right,
families and kids. I want them I wish that they were aware that there's more out there, that then it doesn't have to feel this awful, because there are a lot of really good schools, and their college search shouldn't make them feel awful because they think there's only 12 good schools or 25 good schools and everything else is a failure. There are 1,000 great schools out there. They just don't happen to know about them. So in some ways, I wish it was that group, that really high intensity, highly performing, now highly anxious group of kids. The other group is basically me in high school, the first generation kid who didn't understand this whole process at all, who looked around and said, oh, her parents went to college. What's she doing? Oh, cool. I'll do that. Okay. Yeah. She's going to college fair? I'll do that. She's going to college? I'll go do that too. That's a great idea. That group of people who need the guidance because they just don't know what to do. They love to learn. The kids love to learn. The parents love their kids, want them to be successful. But there's a perception that this kind of school is not for them. The perception that even college is not for them. It's too hard. It's too expensive. It's too scary. They don't know what to ask. I wish that group of people knew more. So basically the me when I was a kid, I wish that group knew more about us. And at the same time, as much as I want to educate that group, I have to recognize that not all of our schools can fully fund them. And so that becomes a little bit of a challenge as well. But even if we help educate those first generation kids and they don't choose one of our schools, but they go to college because of our message, because of CTCL's message, we've been successful.
Right.
Absolutely. We have been successful.
Now, there's no way possible that I or anyone can expect you to speak on the financial aid for every school in the list. But generally speaking, with CTCL schools, how would you describe, or what kind of financial aid packages typically come out of this group of schools for families? Is it meaty merit, or are there high Pell students at these schools, high population of Pell students? You've mentioned first gens. How diverse are they? So can you kind of address a
Sure.
little bit of that as a whole? I know that we can't talk about them individually, but as a whole.
Absolutely. And this is actually something the board asked me to do about 3 or 4 years ago. We wanted to address sort of the financial piece, but recognizing that you can't do justice to 44 schools policies, just as you said. I can give you some broad strokes, and then like to talk about return on investment, which I think is important as well. So we have 44 schools. One school, Reed College, only does need-based aid. They don't do any merit-based. Sorry, had to cough.
Okay, it's great.
Bard College does need-based except for 2, as in 1-2 awards that are merit-based, not 2 kinds, 1-2 awards that are merit-based. Everything else is need-based. The rest of the schools do a combination of need and merit. And there is a range of how well they meet need. I have seen, because we run a scholarship program and the way that we do it, I've seen a lot of admission letters from these schools. When we do our scholarship program, we did not want to have to evaluate transcripts again. So what we ask is that the student sends a letter of admission from one of our schools as part of the criteria. So I see a lot of merit-based awards, and they run anywhere from $5,000 to $30,000 a year would be kind of the big range that I would say. I see many that are in the 20, 21, 24, 25, 27, $30,000 a year at these institutions. Because they are trying to help families fund the process. They are trying to do the best that they can with that. I think the return on investment piece is important. And return on investment for me is over a lifetime. So sometimes people will say, well, it costs a lot over 4 years. Yes, but at the end of 4 years, you use that education for another 40 years.
Right.
Or until you die. I mean, if you retire, you die kind of thing. Right. So, I mean, I graduated high school at 18. I graduated college at 21. I finished early. So say 22 to make the math more typical. Sure. If I retire at 62, I can only hope, but if I retire at 62, I use that education for another 40 years. Yeah. So really we need to take that cost and divide it out over 40 or 50 years. That's the expense in the long run. It's just all jam-packed at the beginning, which I have a 5-year-old. So I recognize that this is coming someday. So I may not get to retire at 62 as I might hope. But I think that what we need is to think about the big picture. Yes, these schools will fund as well as they can. They will not be able to fund, not every school can fund every family as fully as that family might hope. Right. And I think that is fair of pretty much every school. Last I read, there's something like 118 colleges in the country that fully meet need. And we have about 3 or 4. St. Olaf does, Denison, I think College of Worcester, and Reed. I think those are the 3 or 4 that do meet full need. But that, other than that, you may see some gapping from these schools. Right. Diversity is better. When we talk about domestic students of color, diversity is better at these schools than you might anticipate. A lot of these schools, actually 2, or at least 2, are majority minority. The 2 schools in Texas are now majority minority schools. A lot of the other schools run in the 20 to 35% range, domestic students of color. And often Americans are more curious about the number of Black students on campus. We talk about diversity as a whole, but often the real focus is on Black students and often on Black men to try to understand the campus experience. And so I encourage people to dig down and not just ask kind of shyly, what's your diversity? Because if you have a real thing you want to know, then ask that real thing. If you are a Latinx student and you want to know about Latino students on campus, ask about Latino and Latina. Don't ask about diversity in the big picture. Right. If you want to understand about LGBTQ lives on campus, ask about that. Don't ask about diversity. But many of these schools are more diverse than people realize. We have, I think, between 12 and 15 schools that work with the POSSE program. So they are bringing groups of students, often Black and Hispanic students, to campus. each year and to try to build that cohort. Having students of campus on a majority white campus is, it's hard. It's a hard sell for the students. It's hard sell for the institutions. It's hard sometimes to get faculty. So what you're asking for students really to do is to take a chance and be leaders on those campuses, which puts a lot of pressure on those students of color. So it's not for them sometimes just about understanding how to be students and how to be people and how to be people of color, but it's how to be students of color and voices. Because unfortunately, I think majority white campuses tend to look at their minority people and say, so what do you think? I expect them to talk for all Asians everywhere. And that's not fair to anybody.
Yeah.
But I think that if people will dig in a little bit, they'll be surprised at the efforts that schools are making, as well as the successes they have had in bringing students of color to campus. I think diversity is bigger than you might expect.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic and great to know as a whole, even not just with financial aid, but also with the diversity that we find on campus. I think that may be a myth out there that they are not as diverse as you've indicated, and that's great news to hear that diversity does exist. Can you think of any really unique programs that exist within the list of 44 schools that kind of stand out in your mind as being like these things are super special? Like these are really cool programs.
There are some really interesting ones. I mean, Agnes Scott College, which is one of the remaining women's colleges, does the Summit program, which is really about helping women understand how to be leaders, not just among women, but just to be leaders, end of sentence kind of thing, not just women leaders, but leaders.
Right.
I see a lot with that. I think that I've already mentioned St. John's and the Great Books program because their program is so interesting, as well as Cornell College with the one class at a time. I think that a couple of different schools have started programs. Wabash has, and Wabash is a men's school in Indiana, by the way, sorry.
Okay.
Wabash and another institution, I think maybe McDaniel as well, have started these programs that are kind of philosophy, economics, and government connected, which I think is such a great way to look at that particular part of the world and to really understand the bigger picture of why people buy, for example, to understand that more philosophical side of economics as well as the practical side. So a couple of schools have done that kind of program. Lynchburg just this fall is going to start a medical humanities minor. So they're trying to pull together the people who want to go into medicine and really give them a broader experience. Again, more on the humanities side and the social sciences and philosophical piece, not just the technical side, because we know med schools can get good technicians, they can get good scientists. What medical schools need and the medical profession needs is people who are also good with people. So that has been a real growth area for a lot of these institutions. Whitman College in Walla Walla, Washington, and Reed College in Oregon have also started computer science programs, which is not stuff that you think about it in liberal arts colleges a lot. But they've had a lot of funding from Microsoft, which makes sense in the Pacific Northwest to really start these programs and bring them up. I've seen some really cool stuff with data science and understanding all this data that's generated by all these computers that we use all the time. But Denison does some really interesting stuff in data science as well. So there's some really cool, interesting programs at these schools that some of them I just think are, they're really wonderful institutions, and they really will in so many ways change people's lives and give them just a different perspective as they go out into the world to become the new leaders. And I think that we don't always think about it on a day-to-day basis, but when we sit back and think about it, that's really what we're trying to do. I always try to think about it as educating the people who will, in essence, take care of me when I'm old.
Right.
Because I'm getting to that point, but older, the people who are going to be the leaders in 20 years and in 30 years that are really going to take our towns and cities and states and country in the directions that we hope will be environmentally and socially good for everybody.
Maria, this has been a fantastic time together, and I'm walking away with a plethora of information that I didn't know before. So I know our listeners have as well. And thank you so much for spending this almost an hour with us today. And thank you for sharing your family with us there. That's exciting.
A little hairy one.
So lovely to have the pup with us, and super
Thank
excited.
you.
Thank you again for joining us, and thank everyone for joining us tonight on Capstone Educational Consultants College Journey Conversations.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. Good night.